webinar, part of the web series Democracy and Constitution, Voice and Letter. The name follows one famous discourse made by Ulisses Guimarães. Today, we continue with our debate on the current state of democracy in Brazil and in the world. It's our pleasure to receive Professor Larry Diamond. Professor Diamond is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution at the Freeman Spogli Institution for International Studies at Stanford University. For more than 6 years, he directs the FSI Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He's also the founding co-editor of the Journal of Democracy and also serves as senior consultant at the International Forum for Democratic Studies of the National Endowment for Democracy. It's our great pleasure to have Professor Diamond here. We are very thankful for his time. Professor, thank you so much for talking with us. I would like to start with a more general question. When looking into the general trends, what is the current state of democracy around the world?
The current state, Fernando, is that we're now in the 14th year of a global democratic recession, and that this recession has been gathering very dramatic negative force in the last few years. Most political systems in the world are in retreat away from freedom and democracy, if they're changing at all. There are relatively few transitions to democracy right now, and the ones we thought might be happening, Burma a few years ago, Ethiopia more recently, Malaysia recently, seem to be stalled. We have countries we thought were reasonably stable democracies that are slipping backwards, and some of them are very big and important democracies like Brazil and India. We have a number of democracies that have been failing altogether, including one some years ago in the European Union, Hungary. We have Russia and China trying to undermine freedom and democracy around the world and spin a narrative that democracy doesn't work to fight the virus, or in virtually any other respect, that authoritarianism is a superior and more efficient way of governing, whether in a pandemic or some other crisis or more generally. And finally, we have the largest and most important in economic size and most important and powerful democracy in the world, the United States, mired in the same kind of grotesque incompetence in managing the virus and willful ignorance and populist exploitation of passions and polarization that you are seeing in Brazil.
And so when we look at these different measures of democracies in the world, is this trend visible in those measures that we political science use and journalists also use? Can we see this negative trend going?
Yes.
Okay.
Fernando, we see it, but I think the measures are underestimating the regression. Freedom House measures sometimes lag a little bit behind the empirical reality. So I think, sometimes Freedom House is slow to recognize the demise of democracy in a country, even like Venezuela 15 years ago, in Hungary more recently. It took them some time to recognize this in Turkey. You do see a downward trend in terms of scores by about 8% between, I think, 2005 and 2019 in Latin America, larger than that in some other regions. But the regression of democracy is, first of all, picking up speed. And so I think unless something changes, we're going to see more dramatic deterioration in future years. And second of all, if you just look at global averages or regional averages, say for Latin America and the Caribbean, and even if you throw out small Caribbean island states and only look at populations over 1 million, which tend to be less democratic than the smaller countries, still it's the case that the regression of democracy is disproportionately affecting very big and geopolitically weighty countries. I am very, very worried about India, which is in the grip of a real kind of ethno-religious hegemonic party and a prime minister and ruling party that are very intolerant of opposition. I don't need to explain why I'm worried about Brazil, though we could talk about it. Venezuela is nearly a collapsed state now. Bolivia and I think in a less visible way, Peru are in serious states of political decay and crisis. And you just go on country after country. Argentina's veering in a very worrisome illiberal direction, predictable, I think, whenever, the former president, Fernandez de Kirchner, gets anywhere near power again with her obsession about covering up for her crimes of the past. So it's a very, very worrisome time. And Bangladesh is another big country that is, been moving backwards for the last number of years. So the regression has disproportionately been characterizing big geopolitically weighty countries.
I want to talk in a couple of minutes about Brazil and other examples, but before that, so if I want to go back and talk about a little bit about this question of what went wrong then, right? So if we look at a quarter century ago, the spread of democracy seemed assured, and the major goal of US foreign policy, for instance, was to advance democratic enlargement in the 90s. Then we talked about democratic promotion in the first decades of the 2000s, right? Anything changed since then? What went wrong when we look at the role of the US and these trends that we are discussing right now?
Well, I think part of what went wrong was an analytical position. That we were using words like assured. And I think when we're talking about human beings and human organizations and societies, I think we should be very careful about the danger of teleological thinking, that there is only one direction of change, and that there's an endpoint to change, a kind of nirvana politically, that when you get to stable, consolidated, liberal democracy, it can never be reversed. And look, empires fall that looked a lot more consolidated than some of the democracies that are in trouble now. And I'll come to the objective factors that led to the unraveling. But the single most telling, and I don't mean to single him out because I have enormous admiration for Adam Jaworski, but one example among many of this kind of intellectual determinism and arrogance was Jaworski and Lomonghi and their colleagues in their remarkable book, which again, I have great admiration for, Development and Democracy, concluding that because between 1950 and 1990 in their data set, there had never been an instance of a democracy breaking down when the country was over $6,055 in purchasing power parity dollars in 1985 dollars, that countries that became democratic above that level, could be expected to live forever. That democracy was, I think his words were, impregnable, and could be expected to last forever. Well, I don't even presume that anymore in the United States, where we have a president and a ruling party in the White House that are desperately trying to figure out a way to suppress as many minority votes as possible in the United States so that they can prevail with an electoral minority in an election that they look to be headed toward losing by a very large margin. I don't think it is obvious that we will be able to conclude that the United States is still an electoral democracy at the end of this year, obviously, if we don't have a free and fair election. So we need to abandon deterministic thinking and recognize that in the end, democracy depends on strong normative commitment by the people in power and by a vigilant society that will police the people in power, and that the rules and constitutional checks and balances can't be assumed to be strong enough to enforce themselves without those two arenas of constitutional defense. What went wrong in the particular era we're living in is so many factors that they're really too numerous to mention. But part of it was the decay of democratic norms and practices in some democracies for different reasons over a long period of time. This was partly driven by rising economic inequality, pressure of globalization, smug, arrogant, and unaccountable ruling elites that seemed to be detached from ordinary people and the pain they were feeling economically due to globalization, the rising levels of inequality, the anxiety they felt about immigration and rising cultural pluralism. I support immigration and I celebrate rising cultural pluralism, but still you've got to acknowledge and somehow engage and bring along people who are anxious about it. And you can't just say to these people, you're a basket of deplorables, we're just going to crush you. And so this provided fertile ground for the kind and other deficiencies of governance and the widening gap, which Jonathan Rodden has brilliantly identified in his recent book, Why Cities Lose, the widening gap between cosmopolitan cities and more culturally conservative and economically anxious lower density population areas and the exurbs and the countryside. And this has all provided very fertile ground for the polarization we see between the kind of revisionist or right-wing, culturally conservative, anti-cosmopolitan, anti-pluralism populist forces represented by Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the United States, Duterte in the Philippines, and so on and so forth. And I think this is the master problem we're struggling with now.
And thinking about this, well, everything we're talking about, currently we are seeing this this pandemic that changed a lot of things in the world, right? And we do see a great variation in the response to COVID in different democracies, right? Is there any lesson there why some democracies are doing better than others in the response to this gigantic crisis that we are seeing worldwide?
Yes. The lesson is it's about, as to rephrase James Carville when he said it's the economy, stupid, in the 1992 campaign, it's governance, stupid. Democracy can be a great asset the transparency and inclusiveness of democracy can be an asset in battling a pandemic, but it doesn't ensure success. It has to be wedded to effective governance. And the countries that have managed the virus successfully have had effective and respected public health bureaucracies, which led the response to the pandemic and which were given the authority to issue a clear and unified analysis and set of instructions to the society on wearing masks, on sheltering in place, on what they were dealing with, that was able to lead a unified national effort to acquire the personal protective equipment for medical workers, the necessary face masks for the population, the testing equipment and the rapid analysis of testing results, and then to put in place extensive contact tracing so that when people were identified as testing positive, their contacts could rapidly be traced, contacted, advised of their having been in contact with someone who tested positive, and then asked to quarantine for 14 days. And if you do that in a systematic way and implement a culture, which we know both Trump and Bolsonaro have been ignorantly defiant of, a culture and ethic of mask wearing, you can beat the virus, you can get ahead of the virus and get to the kind of situation that many European countries or Taiwan or Korea or Japan have been in, Australia and New Zealand now. But you have to have an effective state, you have to have a unified public authority, public health and scientific expertise have to be in the lead, and people need to understand that they need to sacrifice a little bit of their personal autonomy and discretion in order to comply with the necessary collective effort to contain the spread of the virus. Democracies that did that either prevented the virus from getting a foothold or eventually broke the back of the virus and got to the kind of opening that Italy is in now. And democracies that didn't do that look like the public health disasters that Brazil and the United States are right now.
I was just thinking that right now, when a couple of weeks ago, we brought here the professor from MIT, Emil Werner, that using the 2000, well, the crisis, the Hispanic flu crisis, he showed that cities that closed more efficiently actually went out of the economic crisis earlier, right? And one of the things that in Brazil, and I think in the US also, came up was this contrast between is either the health or the economy, right? And when we look at Trump and Bolsonaro, right, and what is happening both in Brazil and in the US, what does explain the results that we are seeing? Both countries are facing, not only Brazil, at least not only a very difficult results in health terms, but also in economic terms, right? We are seeing probably the worst economic downgrade in the history of the country right now. And what explain these bad results that the two countries are facing right now?
Well, I don't think I need to say much more. You have explained it. If you act quickly, decisively, and I will say radically to prevent the spread of the virus by asking people to shelter in place and closing public settings and then reopening gradually and only in a fashion that involves discipline and careful tracking and potentially testing and tracing, and that prevents people from congregating in ways that could spread the virus. And we know what those ways are. They're indoors as opposed to outdoors. They're not wearing masks as opposed to wearing masks. And they're being ignorant and cavalierly defiant of the science here. If you are disrespectful of the science, the virus is going to triumph. And then you're in a situation where you've got to close down again. And if you don't close down, people will nevertheless behave with the kind of close down because they don't want to die from the virus. So you've got the economic calamity that Brazil and the United States are now facing. And you've got it in a spasmodic, recurrent, chronic fashion because you can't get ahead of it. Whereas if you close down thoroughly in a coordinated fashion with people being disciplined and observant of the rules and requirements, then you can get a short hit to the economy, but a reasonable reopening and recovery. And that's what Brazil and the United States are not going to have anytime soon because of their leadership. And I will say that a common thread here for Brazil and the United States are two presidents and leaders around them who are not only defiant of, willfully contemptuous of the public health science, but of environmental science. And so, they cavalierly disregard what Mother Nature is telling us about climate change. And that's the long term. I know it's not the subject of our conversation, but in the long run, we will get past COVID. We've got, maybe a few more years to turn the corner on climate change. And it's the same problem. These people just are not listening to what scientists are telling us and what Mother Nature is doing to us.
But on the other hand, we are seeing that some type of accountability is emerging this week. The economic pressure started to rise in Brazil. The economic players, because exactly of the environmental issues, right? Because this is starting to harm business in Brazil in a certain way, and in the U.S. We saw the recently Trump rally in Oklahoma, for instance, that now is spiking case there in Tulsa again, right? And one of the things I want to divide into two questions here is on the one hand, we can see that some populist leaders are using this COVID crisis and economic crisis to further their intention to decrease democratic accountability, for instance, right? We can think about Hungary as one example. Do you see that the crisis might help these leaders in their attempts to decrease democratic accountability in one way?
Yes, the crisis certainly provides an excuse, an opportunity for illiberal and authoritarian populists to create images of fear and emergency in order to enlarge their power, silence independent media and political opposition, intimidate dissenters of all kinds, and disable the opposition, if not the electoral process entirely. And we're seeing that in countries that are democracies. We're seeing it now in India. I'm really worried about India, I repeat. We've seen it in countries that are, used to be democracies and are no longer, like Hungary, but where things are getting worse. We're seeing it in countries that were competitive authoritarian regimes like Uganda and now they're just becoming, more and more repressive authoritarian regimes. It's slippage across the board with leaders who do not value democracy and either are authoritarian in their current posture or aspire to be authoritarian, using the opportunity of the emergency to enlarge their powers and knock away checks and balances. And this is a very, very dangerous trend, and it needs to be resisted. You don't need to suppress opposition, dissent, political competition, and media scrutiny in order to combat the virus. And indeed, when you suppress independent media, things are likely to get worse because you can't report on what's happening. And so the government is better able to cover up bad news. And people in a virus need to hear and know about bad news.
On the other hand, we can also think that this crisis poses some challenges to these populist leaders, these authoritarian leaders, right? Do you think that this current crisis might help these leaders more or harm them more? Because we hear here in Brazil, for instance, that Bolsonaro and Trump, they are going to cause their own political death, quote unquote, right? If you leave them do and proceed, and this is causing hundreds of thousands of deaths, that will eventually lead to their demise, right? Which we can also think that it's kind of a dangerous argument, because I mean, if you open and you allow people to try to keep keep attacking freedom of media. We are seeing here in Brazil very recently the Minister of Justice opening an investigation against a columnist because he wrote an article about Bolsonaro, this type of stuff. But my question would be, do you see that the probabilistically thinking is these leaders are going to face more challenges or more opportunities by the end of this crisis?
Well, to some extent, that involves political predictions about the future. That with respect to any particular country, I think political scientists are not all that good at making. I will say that you can only defy the laws of nature and scientific realities for so long before they engulf and swallow you. And of course, eventually that's going to happen with climate change, but the fuse with respect to COVID-19, we know is much, much shorter. And I think there's no more dramatic example of that than the fact that President Bolsonaro has now tested positive for COVID-19. And I will say, people in his age group certainly face a very, very serious risk. We don't even know if he's going to be alive in 2 months. So, when people are this cavalier in the face of the virus, they're courting personal as well as national disaster. I think that every political system has its own distinctive properties, okay? So Bolsonaro is about halfway in his term now. If he does survive and runs again for a second term, you have to ask in the case of Brazil, as you have to ask in the case of India, what is the opposition? And is there a viable and unified opposition that presents a compelling and reasonable alternative to a somewhat traumatized, fearful, politically and informationally manipulated population? And when that's the case, that you have this kind of manipulation of information and opposition, divisions and fracturing, and maybe lack of full competence. Even someone who's been an incompetent ruler, it doesn't mean that they can't get reelected. And the whole point about polarization is to harden your base so that it's going to turn out intensely to vote for you. This is Trump's strategy. So I suppose I am reading that we can't assume that Bolsonaro won't be reelected simply because he's doing such a miserable job as president. In the case of the United States, I don't think we should make that presumption either, but Trump has been so incompetent, and the economy is such a mess because of his incompetent management of the virus. And people are so exhausted with his psychological instability and cruelty that I think there's a bigger chance of a landslide against him than a narrow victory for him.
And thinking about that polarization, that's one point here that I don't think we've seen this type of polarization in Brazil before, right? And so even with all this situation, Bolsonaro keeps his 30%. He has supporters that are very, they are very strongly protest against the Supreme Court, this type of things that we haven't seen before in Brazil since the democratization, right?
Well, I was going to say, you've seen it before, but it ended in a military coup.
Yes, exactly. Not since the democratization of the country. And is the level of polarization one of the explanations for these trends that we start our conversation on? These trends, is that one thing that we should pay attention in a country like Brazil and the US as one indication of possible problems with democracy?
Yes, the answer is yes. It is a common sign of democratic decay preceding the demise of democracy in many places in the world. I would say certainly in a striking number of democracies that have broken down in the last 20 years or so, everywhere from Bangladesh and Turkey to Venezuela and Hungary and many other cases, you see, this is not the only scenario, but you see a long period of deepening polarization. And often, as in Hungary, Venezuela, Turkey, exploitation and deliberate intensification of the polarization by an illiberal populist leader who is trying to create a narrative of the good, deserving people who support him or her against the corrupt, ruling liberal establishment. And this should worry us because polarization is deepening. The era of social media disinformation facilitates it. Social media can be a tool to intensify it. And we need to figure out ways to bridge polarization in order to renew, or to use a word from my late colleague and dear friend Juan Lintz, re-equilibrate democracy after crisis. And part of that has to involve, I think, and this is one of the lessons of successful electoral strategies against illiberal populism, whether it be in Greece in the recent national elections, in Turkey in the recent municipal elections, or I'd say very recently in Poland in the presidential election on Sunday, although it looks like the pro-democracy candidate may have narrowly lost, but still he overcame very great odds to even get so close. What you see is that when Democrats were successful in recovering or renewing democracy, it's because they created very broad coalitions and really didn't play into the game of polarization and just trying to deepen and mobilize their base, but tried to generate a counter narrative. And of course, that's what Biden and the Democrats are trying to do in the United States now, in the face of Trump's polarization strategy.
We just received a question from someone who is watching the webinar, and it's exactly on that topic, right? Is what do you think is the role of the internet and social media in this scenario? You already talked a little bit about that, but also the role of these tech companies, right? Do they have any role in this? Facebook this week just put down, for instance, exclude some profiles of people who worked for Bolsonaro, including inside the palace, right, and who were part of this orchestrated campaign against adversaries, right? But are these companies doing something, or do they have a role in that organization and to deal with hate speech or polarization in the internet, or should this come from governments and the state?
Well, we don't want governments to be doing this, because then you're sliding down a very, very slippery slope toward political censorship and control of speech. That's a very, very dangerous path. So it's much better done by non-governmental actors. The question is whether the companies alone are the best decision makers on this. Now, Facebook has taken, I think, a positive step by appointing an advisory council to advise it on the takedown of posts that violate its own terms of acceptable free expression. I will just say, in addition, that I think the social media companies should not take down political speech simply because it's, offensive to some opinions. They should take down political speech when it is, as you say, hate speech, deliberately inciting of racial, ethnic, or religious hatred. Running the risk of and having the subterranean, at a minimum, intention of inciting violence. Or they need to act when such speech is blatantly, demonstrably, willfully false. And then that speech can be tagged as such with references to correct information, or it can be taken down altogether. But they can't just hide behind a shield of pseudo-political neutrality and say that this is not our responsibility. We're not publishers, we just have a medium out there that we provide. They do have some responsibility for their content, and they need to recognize that and be more proactive and vigilant, at a minimum, in labeling demonstrably false information and in removing explosively hateful speech.
Connected to that, we are seeing in this crisis, the COVID crisis, a lot of use of big data and internet data, cell phone data to track movements of people, right? Do you see any risk after the crisis is over on that level of information that government might have access to on individuals for democracies around the world?
Yes, there's an enormous risk, and people need to be very well organized and clear in their advocacy for ground rules to ensure that this risk is minimized. I urge everyone to have a look at the MIT Technology Reviews tracker of these COVID-19 tracking apps, and the criteria that they have generated for evaluating these mobile apps and for laying down markers, standards for responsible regulatory policy. And just to give you some examples, when these apps are put on people's mobile phones, if they are, there is, I'd say, an ethical and democratic requirement that we have some evidence that the apps are necessary to ensure public health, and that they do some good for public health, number one. Number two, the apps should be limited in time to the crisis and not beyond, and they should be deactivated after that. Number three, we need strong regulations in terms of what happens to the data collected by the apps, who holds the data, and for how long. So if it's data about who you've been in contact with, whether you have the virus or not, and so on, there's no reason why this data should be held for longer than 3 to 6 months. And it should be, it should dissolve in databases after that. There should be a clear time limit to it. And we need clear ground rules about what other information governments may be collecting beyond public health data and geospatial location data that they shouldn't be collecting from people's cell phones. And you can't rely on the government to monitor itself. So there needs to be an independent ombudsman or monitoring agency that's looking at what government is doing and ensuring that government is complying with all these other regulations that I'm specifying. And we need, as the MIT Technology Review advocates, to have transparency in the algorithms that are being used to collect this data, and in the design of the apps, which should be through open source code, so we know what they're doing and we can evaluate it. And if these standards aren't met, then people's civil liberties and their privacy are in very serious jeopardy.
Professor, we are approaching the end, but I want to talk a little bit more about Bolsonaro, right? So The Economist a couple of weeks ago showed some numbers that now 10 of Bolsonaro's 22 ministers are military men, and 3,000 others military men are in government jobs, right, in the executive alone. Is it common in democracies to see so many military with important roles in the government? Now it's not officially the minister, but while we don't have another minister of health, a general is doing the job? Or is Brazil now an exception in terms of democracy to have so many militaries in key roles in the government?
This is exceptional, and it's dangerous. It's not only dangerous to constitutional democracy in Brazil, it's dangerous to the military as an institution, which shouldn't be, even if these are retired generals, shouldn't be bearing such a heavy burden of governing responsibility for areas outside their expertise of national security, national defense, public order, and so on and so forth. I think that we see in Latin America a considerable reluctance on the part of many Latin American militaries to be drawn back in to governing or even maintaining of internal order, and to lose the position of political neutrality and specialized functioning around the roles of national security and national defense that the military has carved out for itself as the proper space for the armed forces of a democratic country. And I think even many military leaders in Latin America are concerned to defend their autonomy and integrity from being dragged in by civilian political leaders, which after all, Bolsonaro now is one, who want to use the military for their own political purposes. So, I wouldn't necessarily blame the military for this, but I don't think it's advisable. I do think it is potentially dangerous. And I think that, of course, once military officers retire, they have a lot of organizational experience and expertise, but their role in governance, even after they retire in a cabinet or sub-cabinet position, should certainly be limited.
And we go back to the discussion that we have, that it's the governance at the end of the day, right? And so we have our third minister of health and a military that is not an expert, and we have 30 militaries appointed to them to work directly with the minister of health, and they are not expert and they are not expert in public health. And I wanted to ask you another thing that was about your reaction. I'm not sure if you saw the whole video or just excerpts of the video of that meeting between Bolsonaro and his cabinet, right? And when Bolsonaro said that he wanted to arm the population to help protect liberty, right? So the discourse there is where I wanted to give arms to the population to avoid a dictator to arise. I just wanted to get your reaction to that meeting and to this specific quote that about Bolsonaro.
Well, first of all, when someone with Bolsonaro's historic contempt for the democracy that exists in Brazil and open admiration for the prior period of military rule, and therefore someone with his, hardly disguised authoritarian tendencies starts talking about arming the population, it doesn't sound like liberty is the goal that he has in mind. This is a kind of, it may come from the right rather than the left, but it's a kind of Hugo Chavez mentality at work. Obviously, he doesn't intend to arm, people who oppose him politically. So, what does this mean? It's very, very dangerous and irresponsible talk. And look, we've got enough problems of gun violence, both in the United States and Brazil. We don't need having it exacerbated by presidents talking about arming the population. It's classic authoritarian populism.
Actually, someone found a very, very similar quote. Well, it was basically the same quote from Mussolini in the 30s. It was exactly the same quote there. Before we end, we also got a different question from someone who is watching, and I think it's a very, very interesting and important question to get to the end of our conversation. The idea is that he says that we see companies in Brazil that strongly support the presidents of Bolsonaro and the projects of his Minister of Economy, Paulo Guedes, right? And our national stock market is still holding a strong confidence in the economic strategy, and we even in this crisis going up, right? And the question that he sends is, what is the role of the private sector in a democratic crisis? How to bring the private sectors to believe in democratic advantages and the advantages of democracy?
Well, I think that the first imperative is for stockholders to demand that their corporate leaders look beyond short-term performance of the company's stock to the longer-term interests of both the company and the national economy. And if short-term circumstances, which can temporarily be segmented from the overall circumstances of the people, the society, and even the larger economy and trends in unemployment. And there's the same thing is happening in the US, as you know. If short-term circumstances are good for the stock market, but the fundamentals of the economy in terms of employment and purchasing power and industry are trending downward, and debt is being piled up on debt in the absence of the income that would flow from a healthy economy. Eventually, what's going to happen to the stock market? It can't stay up there forever. There's going to be a massive correction. So business needs to be reminded of their obligations both to their shareholders and the society at large to worry about the medium to long run interests of their companies, not to mention the whole national economy. And a lot of, I don't know if this is the case in Brazil, but certainly in the United States, a lot of trade unions are invested with their pension funds in the stock market, certainly teachers and public sector unions and so on. States have their pension funds, the individual US states invested as institutional investors in the stock market, and they can use their leverage to demand more responsible concern for the long run interests of the economy and society.
And to finish our discussion today, and I really want to thank you for your time. We are trying to do this series on discussions on democracy in Brazil, since it's an important topic, and a recent poll from Datafolha showed that support for democracy in Brazil has reached high record stakes here. But I wanted to go back a little bit to one topic that we start our conversation, that is the role, for instance, of China in this kind of propaganda and this kind of discussion that we start to see around the world, that some authoritarian regimes might be better in terms of dealing with the economy or facing with crises such as the health crisis today that we're seeing around the world. How do you see this type of discussion? Is that increasing more recently, and how worrisome should we be to this situation?
Well, certainly it's increasing because China is spending billions of dollars to increase it. This is the Chinese party state's global propaganda narrative that democracy is decadent, it doesn't work. The US under Trump is an example of that. Democracy is intrinsically inferior to the efficiency and solidarity that's produced by the strong guiding hand of the Chinese Communist Party. And then you get into even more nefarious lines of propaganda with some Chinese actors, including a spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry, suggesting that the virus might have been started by the United States as an act of biological warfare, which is particularly pernicious and irresponsible, since we know it began in Wuhan, either in the wet market or in a virology lab where, you know, it might have escaped. But this is, you know, this harkens back to the era of Soviet disinformation, and communist regimes are, you know, certainly not morally constrained in any way to have their arguments and propaganda feeds bear any relationship to the truth. Whatever serves the interests of the party state and its quest for global dominance, you know, is morally justified for the larger cause. And democracies need to be pushing back and countering with the truth. You know, the former head of the US Information Agency and one of our greatest journalists, Edward R. Murrow, said in the 1960s, the truth is the best propaganda and lies are the worst. And we need to do a much better job now. Unfortunately, Trump is pushing in the wrong direction with the way he's been politicizing our global broadcasting. I hope and believe this can be recovered in a new administration. But the best antidote to this is just the truth: independent, pluralistic, well-reported, well-researched news and information, and fact-based, intelligent, challenging dialogues like the one I think we've been having here.
Professor, I want to thank you so much for your time. And if you want to end up with a final message to our viewers here, and thank you again for spending this hour with us. And we are keeping these dialogues constantly here at JOTA because exactly we feel that talking about democracy, talk about the challenge that we have forward is very important in our society. Thank you very much again for your time. And if you want to end our conversation with a final message to our viewers, we appreciate your time.
Yeah, well, thank you, Fernando, and thank everyone for listening. I would just say to Democrats, small d, from whatever party, in the United States and Brazil, number one, don't despair, both in terms of the virus, the coronavirus, and in terms of the political virus of illiberal populism. We're going to get past this, but it's going to happen more quickly if we organize ourselves in an effective, well-strategized way. And I repeat, that can't involve playing into the polarizing logic of these illiberal populists. It has to involve transcending the political divides, kind of rising above some of our own partisan and ideological impulses, and responding to the urgent political imperative the way the Campaign for the No did in Chile in 1988. And that means broad alliances against authoritarian challenges to get rid of this political virus. And once we do that, we can go back to our political arguments.
Thank you very much, Professor Diamond, and we keep in touch.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.